So Ben, your parents were avid sailors who sailed around the world shortly after you were born. How big of a role did sailing play in you growing up? Was it expected that you would go into it? Tell us about the early life.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but just thanks for having me along, and thanks for standing in, Chloe. I think this has been a bit of a last-minute stand-in job, so thanks for doing that. I got into sailing with my family. My parents were both keen sailors. Actually, I grew up my early years in Cheshire, so about as far away from the sea as you can get in the UK, and we did some sailing in North Wales, in Anglesey, and then I was really lucky. I was about 8-9 years old. My family moved to Cornwall, and that's really how my sort of love affair with sailing really got going, because obviously so many great opportunities to get on the water in the West Country. And we lived not far from a sailing club, a very well-known sailing club near Falmouth called the Strongett Sailing Club. And we had some fantastic parents who were volunteering, coaching the young kids in the area. And they themselves were really talented sailors racing at a national level. And they sort of took it on themselves to train up the youngsters, and I was lucky to get involved with that. And that's really where it all started.
Great, that's amazing. Was there like a discernible moment where you realised this was no longer a hobby and you wanted to be a competitive racer? How did that come about?
Yeah, I don't think there was any one moment of realisation. I guess as a youngster I got more and more into the sport, and then I started, as I guess most youngsters do, looking at events like the Olympic Games and dreaming about maybe one day even thinking about having a crack at qualifying for and racing in the Olympic Games, and then other big events in the world of sailing like the America's Cup. And we used to have a big ocean race called the Whitbread Race, which became the Volvo Race, which was also one of the sort of pinnacles or goals for most aspiring young sailors. So that's what I was inspired by. And then I started racing more and more, started racing internationally, and progressed through the different squad levels. We're lucky in sailing in the UK, the Royal Yachting Association are a fantastic governing body for the sport and provide a lot of great coaching for youngsters coming through. So I went through that program and progressed to Youth World Championships, which is again kind of like Youth Olympics, if you like, for sailing. And so then it became more obvious that perhaps that dream might become a reality if I kept training really hard and pushing hard. I suppose where it did become more clear-cut, I was 18, I was studying for my A-level exams, and I made the qualification for the 1996 Olympic Games. In sailing, there's only one spot per nation, per class of boat, so that's pretty tough to make that jump. And then I had this difficult decision: was I going to train full-time for the Olympics, or was I going to try to finish my studies? So I cut a nice deal with my mum that I would take some time out, take 6 months out to train for the Olympics, and then come back and finish my studies afterwards, which I managed to fulfill that side of the bargain and keep my mum happy, which, as we all know, is very important.
Mm. So you mentioned sort of going to the Olympics at a very, very young age. How did you deal with the pressure of that? Did you understand at that age what you were getting into, or could you comprehend what you were doing at the time?
Not really. I guess I was so young. My sort of youthfulness was an advantage in that I was completely, no idea what I was walking into with the Olympics. I'd obviously raced internationally and started doing well internationally. The year of the Olympics, I won the European Championships and I was third in the World Championships. So I was on this really fast progression. There was one sailor, a Brazilian sailor called Robert Scheidt, who was totally dominant in the sport in the laser class, which I was sailing at that time. And so that was really the target, to try and get up and to beat the famous Robert Scheidt. And that was really all I was sort of consumed by. But I did get to those Olympics, and I was completely blown away going to, the Olympic Stadium and seeing all these incredible athletes that you see on the TV, and suddenly standing next to them or seeing them. And it's fair to say I was slightly awestruck by the whole occasion. So I didn't start off that well. The first race of the series, I think I finished 27th, something like that, 24th, 27th, had a disastrous race. And I really had to sort of gather my thoughts. We do we did 2 races a day in those days, so I had about half an hour between races to sort of gather my thoughts and try and get my head straight and get back on the program, which thankfully I managed to do. But yeah, the Olympic Games is such an incredible opportunity to be able to just experience that, let alone to compete in it.
I think from my understanding of it, sailing can be quite a technical sport. When you're in it and you were kind of, let's say this race didn't go your way or didn't go too well, and then you reflect on it, in the moment are you very aware that it's not going well, or can you kind of just feel something's not right? But how much thinking is going on, and how much can you tell is actually happening? Yeah,
it's a good question. And sailing is one of those sports. So a race, and again, those changed a little bit now. The races are slightly shorter, but in those days the races lasted around 60 minutes. You do 2 races a day, like I said. So you do have time in a race to think about how badly things are going and how you're going to sort that out. And it's a very psychological game in that respect. People sort of liken competitive sailing to sort of chess on water, because not only do you have all of your other competitors, but you obviously have the elements that you're fighting as well. The winds are constantly changing in strength and direction, and the sea states and the tides, and you've got to sort of try and compute all of that whilst racing all of these other boats. So it's very tactical. It's one of those sports where actually it's the person who makes the least mistakes and obviously sails the boat the fastest that will come out on top. So yeah, plenty of time to reflect on your mistakes.
Interesting. Now, there's sort of, certainly recently with kind of access into sports and equality and things like this, we've seen a rise in lots of programs trying to get more children into things like sailing and trying to, there's criticisms over sailing being an elitist sport. Do you think they're fair? Is there anything that you are currently doing or would like to do to increase more young people getting into the sport?
Yeah, look, I can completely understand people saying that sailing is an elitist sport at the very highest level. It's extremely expensive to compete. In the America's Cup, we spend hundreds of millions of pounds designing and building one race boat for an event. The Olympics, actually the hardware, the boats are in the scheme of things not that expensive, but you have to compete full time. It has to be your full-time career if you're going to win at the Olympic level. But pretty much every other sport is the same. Olympic cycling is really expensive. Any sport that you compete at the highest level, you're going to have to be full-time, you're going to have to be professional and committed to it. I think what's really important, and to answer your question, at the grassroots level, sailing is actually much less expensive than people imagine it to be. I mean, most sailing clubs you can go down to, you don't need to own a boat, you can just borrow a boat, or a lot of sailing clubs have initiatives such as Sail for a Fiver, which is about trying to get local school kids down to their sailing clubs and out in the water, for £5, which again is comparable to a lot of other sports. So yeah, you don't need to own a boat, you don't need to own all the equipment. A lot of sailing clubs have access to the facilities, to the coaching and to the equipment. But it is something as a sport we can always do a better job of helping people of the realisation of how easy it is to access the sport, and it's a lot of fun. But I hope certainly in the last 10 years that this transition to sailing to foiling boats that we see in the America's Cup and in events like Sail GP, which we also race in, which is a new global sailing circuit, the speed and the excitement of these boats and how they fit televisually we would like to think is inspiring a new generation of youngsters that maybe 10 years ago they might have looked at sailing and thought it's a bit of a slow, boring sport. Now they think it's a pretty cool sport, seeing these boats foiling out of the water at close to 100 kilometres an hour.
Yeah, amazing. And talking about boats, what was it that drew you towards like dinghy boats and stuff like that?
Well, as a youngster, going down to the local sailing club, like I said, dinghies are naturally what you would try and progress into and learn to sail. And I learned to sail on a boat called an Optimist, which most people, sailors in the room would know. It's a very popular boat for young kids up to the age of 15. It looks a little bit like a bathtub, and the performance isn't much better than a bathtub going through the water, but that's part of the sort of the challenge of the boat and what makes it so special. It's actually quite difficult to sail, and so for youngsters to learn to sail a boat like that, it doesn't the water doesn't drain out of the boat, so you have to bail the water out, which makes it even harder to sail. Has lots of really annoying little ties, sail ties, and you have to tie all these little knots intricately and absolutely perfectly. So the youngsters really have to learn how to maintain the boat, how to rig the boat. Obviously sailing a boat, as I said, is quite a challenge. And they're sailing it on their own, so they've got to sort of think for themselves. So that's an obvious route for youngsters to go down as they get into the sport, and then they progress to different boats, different dinghies where they might sail with other people, and then start building those relationships, and then ultimately moving on into sailing in bigger boats, keel boats, and then boats like the America's Cup boats. Also ocean racing is a big part of the sport, which has really transformed again in the last 10 years or so, with more of the foiling technology now coming into ocean going boats. And those, the performance there is phenomenal. There's a record called the Jules Verne record, which is non-stop around the world, anything goes. And that's now close to getting under 40 days, which is phenomenal for a sailing craft to sail around the world in under 40 days. Someone will break that record pretty soon of 40 days, and that would be an amazing feat.
It's amazing. So, talking kind of about your own journey, and you've gone to numerous competitions around the world, is there a class that you've competed in, or particular kind of highlights from your career so far that you think that was a great moment, that was a great race, or I just really liked this piece of equipment that came around that year and changed things for me?
Well, best event would have to be London 2012, the home Olympics. You just can't beat that, and just loved that whole experience. Just being at the home Olympics, let alone competing in it, was really special for everybody. And we were, I think it's one of the only recent British summers where it didn't rain for 2 weeks solidly. So we put on a good show, I think. We'd like to think London put on a great show, Britain put on a great show. And best sailing experience, I think, really is this, like I said, these new foiling boats, the AC-75, which is a 75-foot monohull we sail in the America's Cup. These are purpose-built, built individually to the teams, and they are just incredible pieces of kit to sail, incredibly powerful and graceful. The F50, which is the boat that we sail in Sail GP, is similarly really exciting. The performance is similar to the AC-75, but it's a smaller boat, obviously. It's a multi-hull. There isn't quite as much protection in the boat, in the cockpits of the boat, so it's a bit more like sailing a big dinghy. And again, the speeds are just phenomenal. So it's been a real privilege, I think, to be part of the sport as it's been going through this transition into the foiling boats, and to have been able to compete at the highest level in both sort of your sort of more classic design displacement boats, and now into this foiling classes of boat that we now have.
So you've spoken about speed and things. When it comes to like designing boats and stuff, we know in other kind of F1 and kind of racing and stuff like that, it's the drivers, it's the sports players who get to determine what they like and kind of design and build the piece of equipment to their taste. In any of your races, have you been able to kind of communicate to the people designing these boats and making them, this is what I really like, this is what I want for this race? How much kind of say do you get in the boat that you're using?
A lot, and the answer is clearly not. I haven't been doing a good enough job in the last 2 America's Cup teams that we've had. We haven't won. We were a new team for the 2017 America's Cup. We were a second generation team for the 2021 America's Cup in New Zealand. We made it to the Challengers final, but we lost to the Italian team Luna Rossa, so we didn't make it all the way. So it's very much that the sailors on the boat, there were 11 in the last cup, there'll be 8 on the boat in this next cup, have to feed back to the designers all the time. How does the boat feel? How's it performing? As we go through the testing and development stages. And but that's a team game. So the designers are using a lot of computer simulation to try and develop the fastest hull shapes, sail shapes, foil shapes. And we get the boat out in the water, so we've got a test boat we're going to have in the water later this year in Palma and Mallorca, and that boat will serve a number of purposes from a technical perspective, but one of those is as sailors we get out on the boat and we start feeding back to the designers, how does it feel and how do we think we can improve it, and how do we think as sailors we can create the fastest techniques for that particular boat.
Great. And so since retiring from competitive racing yourself, you've become a team lead for the UK's America Cup team. Was this something you've aspired to kind of get to? Is it a point that you've always looked at and gone, that is where I've made it? Or how did you kind of feel about retiring and
I haven't retired quite yet.
Oh.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry.
I stopped Olympic sailing in 2012. So since then we've moved to the America's Cup and CLGP. So I still race, but yes, I put the team together. So we now have an America's Cup team, which we have a fantastic partnership with Mercedes Formula One team, and that is merging those two groups together. And we have now 200 people focused on the program, between design, manufacturing, sailing, and we also compete in a circuit, as I said, called CLGP, which is this new global circuit, which is backed by Larry Ellison of Oracle fame, and that's a really exciting race circuit that we also compete in, and I compete in that. But yeah, I'm 45 years old now. I like to think I can still contribute and still race at the highest level, but at the moment that I don't think I can, I'll be the first person to take myself off the boat. We have a really, really talented sailing team. We've got Giles Scott, who won his second gold medal in Tokyo last year. And actually, really excitingly, in this next America's Cup, we're going to have the first ever Women's America's Cup. We have a Women's America's Cup and a Youth America's Cup. So we have Hannah Mills, who is the most successful female sailor in Olympic history, who will lead that team for us, lead that Women's America's Cup team. So we've got a really, really talented group of sailors in the UK that are part of these teams, and the next generation coming through, which is great to see.
Cool. Amazing. I'm going to ignore these questions now.
That's a stitch up.
Never do an interview last minute, that's what we've learned. In terms of, so what kind of, getting to have so much experience and years of experience, and now seeing these new people come in and getting to work with them, is there anyone you've worked with who you've thought they're going to be an incredible sportsman or woman at some point, and who's someone we should look out for?
Yeah, so Giles and Hannah, who I mentioned, are actually now coming to the end of their Olympic careers and being hugely successful in that arena. And then it's looking to who are the next generations coming through the Olympic squad that can potentially make it into the America's Cup. And again, we're really fortunate with the Royal Yachting Association. They do a great job of nurturing that talent and bringing it through to the Olympic level. But actually, I still think there's room for more mentoring, more apprenticeships, if you like, of getting really talented young sailors. Maybe they don't make it to the Olympics, but they're still really talented and they're hungry, and they could still make it in professional sailing. So how can we create a pathway to help more of those youngsters, and not necessarily just in sailing, but in design, technology, and boat building? So that's something that we've strived to try and help many youngsters come through with the America's Cup teams in the last 7 or 8 years that we've been in business. But that's something we can do a better job of, and so we've formed a new pathway program called the Athena Pathway Program, and that's where the youth and women's America's Cup team will progress through, which Hannah, as I mentioned, will lead that. But also, where can we find more young people that are really inspired to get into the marine industry and try and help them have a fantastic future in that industry?
Talking about kind of women in the sport, are we, is there anything being done in the sailing community to increase kind of girls getting into the sport, and once they're in, retaining them, helping them get to the kind of professional levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Women's America's Cup, it's the first time in the history of the Cup. 1851 was the first America's Cup, and this is the first fully crewed Women's Cup, so that's a great step forward. I mentioned the Youth America's Cup. We actually committed with our team, with Hannah, that we would be gender equal in our youth team, which I think is also a great step forwards and a great mark. And these competitions are at the highest level of the sport. So if we can as I said, if through our pathway program, if we can step back from that and actually go more to youngsters, like yourselves coming through university, that are looking, what does their career pathway look like coming out of university or college or school, getting into sports like sailing and trying to provide those opportunities for them. That's absolutely what we're focused on trying to do.
Amazing. In terms of kind of the marine side of things as well, like I have to ask as a geographer, what, do you sailors go out and are you seeing, pollution in the oceans? Is there anything the sailing community are doing? Does it bother you? What is this kind of consensus around the sailing community? Do they care?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the oceans are our pitch, really, if you think about it. That's what we need to race on. And so we have to try and protect our pitch. Of course, when you travel around the world, very fortunate to get to travel to some wonderful venues to sail, but there are periods where you go to a particular venue like Rio de Janeiro, which traditionally has a lot of trash in the water because of the big river delta that they have there, and the ocean tides that are coming through. So to answer the question, yes, there is a lot that the sport is doing. SailGP, the league that we compete in globally, has a massive sustainability agenda. In fact, we race for a thing called the Impact League. So whilst we race on the water, we also race off the water in the Impact League, and each individual team is judged on how efficient they can be, what innovative solutions they can come up with around sustainability to save energy, to have better recycling, and also to be collaborative, to share those ideas with the other teams, and we all get ranked on those ideas and how efficient we are. And at the end of the season, there's an overall winner of the Impact League, and there's prize funds for the Impact League which go to your purpose partner or your charitable partner. And in our case of our team, we actually moulded our SailGP team around the banner Protect Our Future, and with the idea being to have a collaboration of like-minded partners to come together, businesses that are really pushing sustainability and trying to come up with some of these innovative solutions to tackle climate change and boost sustainability. So yeah, I think everyone involved with the league is really proud of the initiatives it's undertaken.
In terms of climate change, then, is there, obviously your whole sport is dependent on the weather and the kind of elements and whether they're in your favour and things like that on the day. Is there any kind of areas around the world where people are now starting to sail more or less, or where the conditions are just maybe not quite right? Has there been any noticeable impacts, or is you not noticed anything?
I think all around the world people have seen weather patterns changing, haven't they? And that will undoubtedly and has had an impact on sailing. But in some areas where you maybe were relying on traditional trade winds and they're not there anymore, you get different sailing conditions. A good friend of mine is a Sydney sider, and was talking about how Sydney through this summer and now into their winter has just had so much rainfall, and it's really affected their sort of traditional weather patterns. And so yeah, we're seeing that around the world, and that's of course is a negative impact that's coming from climate change that unfortunately is only going to continue for the short to medium future. It's what can we do that's going to affect things in 100, 200 years time, where grandkids and great-grandkids are having to deal with these issues.
So we'll now look to the audience to just see if anyone has a question. If you just raise your hand and Arsha will hand you the mic. So this member in the white t-shirt.
So Ben, you sailed the quite crude foiling boats in San Francisco, and then more recently the much more efficient ones on the Hauraki Gulf. If you won the America's Cup, where would you take it next?
Yeah, winning the America's Cup is the ultimate goal. As I said, it started around the Isle of Wight in 1851. It's the only sporting trophy Britain has never won. And I think if we win it, we have to hold it back on the Solent where it all started. That's just, it's bringing it home. That's what it's all about.
Okay. The member with the glasses just at the back there. If you could please stand up when you ask the question, it just helps.
Thank you. I have a question about the technology gap in the America's Cup. So as the technology gap expands, I would assume the boat in first place, their crew could make more mistakes, and as it contracts, they'd have to make fewer mistakes to still win. How do you see the technology gap changing over, say, the last 20, 30 years and then into the future?
Yeah, so you're right. It is all about technology. The class of boat has changed a lot in those years. So in 2010 was the first time there was a big shift in the class of boat. Up until then, I think it'd been pretty much the same class of boat for about 25 years. Then we moved into these massive giant multi-hulls in 2010, and they then morphed into the foiling multi-hulls that we saw in the 2013 America's Cup. And that's really was the start of this transition into foiling boats. Typically when you get a new class of boats, we had a new class of boat for the last Cup in last year, then you end up with quite a big difference in the different teams' approach to that new class of boat. How do you tackle that? And we've seen the New Zealand team being really dominant, and in the last two cycles of the America's Cup, their design team were really doing a fantastic job, particularly this last Cup with this new concept of boat. I mean, albeit it was their concept, so you'd imagine they'd be pretty good at it. But so that's how it develops. And then as you go further through a class of boat, this will be second generation. I'd imagine this class of boat, it's very successful. It could continue for another 4 or 5 iterations of America's Cup. And each time the class rule will get slightly adapted and matured. But you start getting to the top of the sort of design envelope, and the difference in performance between the teams gets narrower and narrower, and it becomes more then about the sailors and how well can they adapt to the boat, how can they develop the specific techniques to really get 100% performance, or as close to 100% performance out of the boat. And so it's interesting as you go through these different stages in the Cup, how that changes. This time, I expect there will still be some quite big performance differences. What's interesting about this next America's Cup is the venue, which is Barcelona, which is a fantastic venue, but it's also, for those that have maybe been to Barcelona, sailed there, will know that you can get quite big waves in Barcelona, and these foiling boats generally don't handle waves that well. Auckland, for example, was primarily a very flat water venue. It's very enclosed. So that will be a big challenge for all of the design teams in this next cycle, and I think that will be a big part of that will be a big performance differentiator of the sea state. The technology is absolutely key. It's fascinating as a sailor to work with these designers like we do now with the Mercedes Formula One team. I know a lot more about Formula One now than I ever did, and again, they're an amazing outfit. They've won the last 8 Constructors' Championships. Of course, Lewis Hamilton has won now 7 Drivers' Championships. They're having a bit of a tough time this season with, again, new classic car, which has caused some challenges, but just seeing how they're working through that, and it must be incredibly frustrating, or it is incredibly frustrating for them, given their domination, but they're not letting it rattle them. They're just keeping their heads down, working through the challenges, and I'm sure that they will get themselves back to the front of the grid very soon.
Okay, we'll take a member in the Navy jumper.
Thanks for coming. So you're the skipper of the British team, but you're also the CEO and the team principal, whereas at some of the other teams, those roles are split up amongst different people. I was just wondering what that's like, sort of taking on more of the administrative roles as well in the organisation, whether that's a help, a hindrance, in what different ways.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's kind of both really. Ultimately, I put the team together back in 2014, and then the backers that we have for the America's Cup teams, so Jim Ratcliffe and the INEOS organisation, that supporting a lot of really top high-level sports teams. And it's really exciting for us to be a part of that. But part of my role as a CEO is working within the INEOS organisation. But to be able to sail on the boat as well, and to ultimately be competing at that level, I need a fantastic team around me to help manage that, which I do, in the America's Cup team and the SailGP team. So in the America's Cup team, we have a guy called Dave Endine, who's our chief operations, and he's got a huge amount of experience in the sport, in the America's Cup, huge amount of respect within the team, and throughout the different departments in the team, we have great people who do a fantastic job managing the team, managing their departments. So my job really is to oversee the programs and try and make sure that we're heading in the right direction as much as we can. And then when we get out on the water, I get out with the sailing team and give it my best shot. But like I said earlier, I'm coming through this transition phase in my career where I'm spending less time on the water and more time in the management of these teams, which is a fascinating transition. But ultimately, it will come to a point where I don't get to go out in the water anymore, which will be a sad day, but it's an inevitability that comes to all of us as we progress through our careers.
Okay, then the member in the black jacket.
Thanks for coming, Ben. There's a lot of different disciplines in sailing. We've talked about fleet racing a lot, but how exactly did you get into match racing, and what was it that you liked about it?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. I got into match racing through the America's Cup. It is a match race, for those that don't know. It's a one-on-one race. It's not fleet racing, which is what we traditionally do in the Olympics or in SailGP. Match racing has always been a one-on-one affair, which makes it really exciting in that sort of gladiatorial sense. And so that coming through the Olympic sailing, I always knew that I really wanted to try and get involved with the America's Cup, and to do that I needed to learn how to match race, and so that's really how that happened. And that was quite a tough transition, because up until then I'd only really sailed in single-handed boats on my own. Then I was sailing with a team in a really intense environment like match racing. There's lots of manoeuvring, really fast interaction between the teams. You have to have really good communication with your team so they know exactly what you're thinking as the helmsman on the boat. And I was terrible at that, because I was just used to doing whatever I wanted. I didn't even have to think about telling anyone, I just did it. So working out how to communicate with other people was a real skill set that it took me a while to develop that. And to be honest, it's still something all of us, I think, and that's what's great about sport. We can always do a better job communicating, and I think that applies to everyday life as well. That how you interact with other people, and you can help explain, as a team where you're trying to get to, and if there are, most critically, if there are issues within a team, that's generally the hardest challenge, right? Is how do you identify that, and how do you approach that as a team? Because it's sort of the elephant in the room that you're not performing or something's not quite right. So that's been a really interesting process and learning experience.
Thank you. Then the member in the blue shirt.
So with the current America's Cup boats being so radical and different to what a lot of us sail, your design team, do they still have sort of a background in maritime engineering, or have you got more sort of F1 based people now? Sort of how do you deal with that change?
Yeah, they do. Majority of our America's Cup designers do come from a sailing background. A lot of them love sailing in their spare time or getting out in the water. Actually, a lot of them not so much sailing now. They're sort of into wing foiling or kite foiling and those sorts of getting out in the water a bit, having a bit more fun. But they do love the water. A lot of them come from a marine background. That said, now with this partnership with Mercedes, a lot of them don't. So they come from a more sort of, motorsport background. But it's a lot of the same challenges you can imagine in a Formula One car. Okay, the aerodynamics are more important than the hydrodynamics. For us, it's pretty much 50-50 between the hydro and the aero challenges. But a lot of the same issues, the complex computer simulation programs to try and design the fastest foil shapes, hull shapes, sail shapes, and then the systems that we're using on these boats, very advanced hydraulic systems that we're using to power these boats and to control these boats. And the manufacturing process, JJ's dad, Michel Marie, has worked with us for a number of years now. is integrated with the team at Brackley, with the Mercedes team, to go through the absolutely the most intense manufacturing processes to make sure we get the boat as strong as possible, as light as possible, and working with the different manufacturing partners to achieve that is a big job.
Thank you. And finally, the man in the navy polo.
Hi, thank you for coming. Actually, as I look out in the room here, I can see quite a few members of the Oxford sailing team, so go Oxford sailing. I think I'd like to ask a question that perhaps I don't think I'm alone in experiencing this, because I did a lot of youth sailing when I was younger, but as I think many of us, when we arrived here, we realized that unfortunately you have to make a choice between prioritizing education or sailing, and I think some of us try to balance that, by being involved in sailing in some ways not. My question is more about how you've been describing your transition between sailing, just rigging up, going on the water and sailing, to now more being a team leader and then managing a large organization. My question was specifically, which skills or which sailing skills did you find to be very applicable and transferable in terms of your semi-transition? Thank you.
I guess like I said, sailing is quite a complex sport when you're competing, dealing with the environment, with the winds and the waves, and then the other competitors. So I guess you have to try and develop those skills to be able to keep clear-headed even when you're in a really intense racing environment, and that in itself is an interesting learning process. But I suppose that and as I said, learning to sail with a team, and again working with a team in a really intense environment, high pressure environment on the water, I think that then helps you when you're with a wider team in a business sense, that you can deal with these high pressure situations, or not. Hopefully you're better at dealing with these high pressure situations because you've been used to it in a sporting environment. And so when people are under pressure, you can identify that, try and help support them through that. And if the team are in low moments, unfortunately we've had a few low moments in the America's Cup the last few times. It's been difficult, had some difficult periods getting our boats up to speed. But the more you experience those, the more it helps you. It's the way of life. It's never going to be, it's never going to be perfect. You're always going to come across challenges, and being able to adapt to those and work through those, the more you experience that. And I think working in a sports team helps you to identify, what works to come through those challenges, and that then is very applicable to everyday life and business in general.
Thank you. Rosie in the black shirt.
So I've heard several athletes discuss the lows that follow competitions, particularly the Olympics, irrespective of how well they've done. And so I was wondering if you've experienced that, and if so, how you've dealt with that emotionally. Yeah,
the Olympic blues, absolutely. That's the thing. Most people competing at the Olympics, the majority don't win a medal, and that's tough. To spend at least 4 years of your life, in most cases a lot more than that, to get to this amazing one-off event every 4 years, and then it doesn't go to plan, that's hugely frustrating. And even if you are fortunate enough to be successful, suddenly that's the end of your 4-year campaign. And I remember the first Olympics I went to, I woke up the next morning and suddenly I had no reason to no purpose in my life. I didn't need to go training. Maybe it was nice for a couple of days, but pretty quickly I was stressing out. What was I going to do next? What did I want the next challenge to be? And so I after that experience, I decided it was very important to always have a plan to move on to. I'm sure you'll do with your studies here, that you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen when I finish my exams, when I graduate? What do I want to do next? Maybe not. But I think so. That's the same with the Olympics. If you can try and have a plan regardless of the outcome, okay, this is what maybe it's to carry on and go for the Olympics again, or to go into a different side of the sport, or to move on from professional sport and move into a different career. But having some idea of what's next, I think, is really important to deal with that.
Thank you. I was just wondering, do you have any advice for kind of people who, whether they're into sailing and they're trying to manage a team, like we've got members of our sailing club here, where it could be managing a team in sport, or it could be generally in life? Have you got any advice for young people going into finding themselves in these positions where they've got to boost morale at difficult times and keep people going and problem solve when they're also under pressure?
Yeah. I think one of the best pieces of advice I had was from a guy called Charles Dunstan, who's a very successful entrepreneur, and he founded Carphone Warehouse and Dixon's, and still has a company called Talk Talk, and he backed me in the early years of trying to get the America's Cup team going. And his advice was, when you're hiring a team, so I'd never hired anyone really before, and I had to try and pull this team together. He said, you need to find people that are better than you, because if you can hiring people that you can just tell them what to do all day long, that's easy, but that's not what you need. You actually need people that are better than you. You can trust them in their role, especially if they're in a management role, that they're going to run their team and they can really perform at the highest level. And so that, don't be afraid to work with really good people, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. There's always a sort of natural apprehension about working with really talented people, that they might make you look bad, but in my experience, the higher the level of people that you can work with and alongside, the better that you're all going to be. And also, when you are in a team environment, it is tough and it's not going to be perfect. And that's something I've had to learn the hard way, that no matter what your target is, you're always going to face big challenges. And trying to, I think, again, comes down to communication when things aren't going well, to keep talking, to keep trying to work through the processes. If you just shut down and the communication stop, then it's just going to unravel and get worse and worse. So when the chips are down, keep talking, keep trying to keep each other going, keep working, don't lose sight of that goal, what you're all working towards. I think those are my learnings.
Thank you. And in terms of goals, is there anything that we should expect from you in the future? Is there anything you're aiming for in the next year or couple of years? Yeah,
with the America's Cup, that's in 2024, so that's a big target for us, and has been now for about 10 years, and we're kind of determined that we're going to get that job done as long as it takes. So hopefully it's not too much longer, but we'll see. We're up against some really tough competition in this next Cup. And SailGP as well is really exciting. This new circuit, I think it's bringing a lot of new spectators to the sport, hopefully inspiring a lot of youngsters to get into the sport. And I was talking about before, the Youth and Women's America's Cup, that's a big step forwards for the sport and for women in sailing. And that's something really exciting to look forwards to in the next couple of years. Thank you. Well, I'd just like to thank you massively for being good sport today. And thanks for having me. Yeah, a very inspiring interview, and a lot of hope for the sport and people going into it. If you would like to join me in thanking Sir Ben Ainslie.